Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another week of mythology. So we're going to be talking about some interesting stuff today. We had our little sort of exploration of gods and goddesses, and we started off, of course, with creation myths. Go ahead and take the gods and goddesses quiz if you haven't already. But today we're going to be kind of responding to myths of creation with myths of destruction. So we're looking at destruction myths, myths in which the world is destroyed. We're actually going to cover two of these big ones today, and so there will be a lot to talk about. So this might take a few videos here. But these will be the myths of the flood and the myth of Ragnarok from Norse mythology. So there should be a lot of interesting stuff to talk about here. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get right into it. So the flood story, you may not know it by that name, but you may have heard, almost certainly have heard of the story of Noah's Ark. So this is the story, again, coming to us from the Abrahamic tradition of a good man who God spares from the destruction of the world. So God destroys the world, but he spares Noah because he was a good man, a righteous man, a noble type of man. And so we have a very famous story here. So I hope you don't mind if we go back through it, and maybe we'll notice some things that we didn't previous times that you have heard that story. Okay, so why does God want to wipe out the human race? Well, it says, quote, that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So that's pretty bad news for humanity. It's a very negative view of humanity. Human beings are evil and doing evil things, and so therefore they should be destroyed. But at the same time, you can kind of have a sort of sympathy for it, right? You can say, maybe there have been times when you felt like everyone in the world was just doing evil continually, and that it all seemed kind of hopeless and dark. So in a way, that's relatable. It makes the story seem more plausible. That yeah, God could look at the ugly world and say, this is worthy of destruction. That seems sort of a reasonable thing to conclude on some sort of psychological level. But you would hope that human beings wouldn't be destroyed all together, all completely. So God points to the example of Noah, who is like the one good man that he finds. So he was blameless in his generation. He walked with God. He had a very close connection with God. And so Noah and his family are spared the destruction of the world in this great flood. All right. So let me switch over to the notes here because we're probably going to need some notes in a second here. So yeah, God destroys humanity with a flood. Except Noah. He's a good man. And the reason for the flood is that everyone else is wicked. Okay, and this story may seem very familiar at this point. God tells him to build a boat, an ark specifically, A-R-K. And so the ark, God, it's interesting that God actually gives very specific instructions on how to build the ark. He tells you what kind of wood, gopher wood, which some scholars think is cypress wood, the cypress tree. He gives you exact sort of measurements for how to build it, which is an interesting touch. You don't always see that in mythology as these very specific measurements. And God basically explains to him what is going to happen, and he asks him to take the animals onto the boat, the animals of the world, so that they are spared, that they survive. And also, interestingly, there's two different versions of this story. Just like we saw with the Abrahamic creation myth at the very start of the book of Genesis, and this is still in the book of Genesis, this is from an early part of the Bible. There are multiple different authors working on this, or at least we think based on them using multiple different names for God at different points in the tale. So if we look at this, we have basically the writer we called the priestly writer and the J writer. The priestly writer was living in the time of Babylon. So he has a tendency to compare everything to two Babylonian creation myths, and we'll see some similarities here to thoughts about Tiamat. And then the J writer is living in Jerusalem, or the earliest equivalent of that anyway. And so his version of the story is much less influenced by Babylonian ideas. But that's just a little note there. The reason I bring it up is because, you know, Noah is famous for bringing the animals into the ark. But what animals did he bring in? In one version of the story, it's 7 pairs of all the clean animals. So specifically the clean animals, and this is a reference to the Jewish dietary code, kosher. So it's all the clean animals, and it's 7 pairs. And so that is what we see in the J version of the story, also known as the Yahweh version of the story, because that's his name for God. So it's only the clean animals, and the unclean animals are not supposed to get on the boat. No, sorry, it's the other way around. It's the priestly writer. Sorry to mix you guys up there. It's the priestly writer who's only concerned with clean animals, and that makes sense, right? Because he's the guy who's very in touch with tradition and trying to establish what are the important rituals of the holy day and things like that. So it's the J writer who actually wants to preserve, who says that God should preserve all animals. And these are 2 of every sort. And this is a slightly earlier passage and earlier writing as well. So this is up in part 6, book 6, whereas the priestly writer is in part 7. So yeah, I just think that's kind of interesting because, you know, how does Noah go about preserving the animals? Well, it depends on who you ask. And I don't know if everyone knows the passage actually contains both answers here. Okay, so yes. So then from there on, we have rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And, you know, it's a long time. And Noah's in there with his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, who are going to be more important in a second. And with his wife, who is never named, and his sons' wives, who are never named. So that's basically what we've got going on here. And we have the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. And then it's interesting how they classify the animals too. They classify them a lot like they did in the creation. Cattle are separate from other kinds of animals. And so are creeping things that crawl on the earth and birds. And then, you know, the fish are fine. They're in the water. But so it was 40 days and 40 nights. And then after that, you know, the mountains are covered. That's how the story goes, is the whole world is flooded. And everything died that was under the water. That's made very clear. And then the waters subside. And then finally, you know, the rain stops after the 40 days, but only after 150 days more does the flood waters start to come down. And the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. There we go. Okay. But I should mention here, the way the rain is described is actually pretty interesting. It's like, basically, what does God say? What's the exact phrase here? Again, this is kind of a priestly versus J thing. The priestly author, I don't have the exact quote here, but he basically says that God opened the gates of the firmament. And we talked about the firmament quite a lot, right? It's the idea of the sky as this solid thing, this sort of big dome. And in Babylonian mythology, we saw that it holds back the waters of Tiamat. It's part of the body of Tiamat, and when it rains, according to Babylonian mythology, the rainwater comes from a kind of leakage through the sky. Then in the book of Genesis, which was actually earlier in the Hebrew creation myth, we saw that there was that exact same concept, that God took the water and he put some of it behind the sky, behind the firmament. And so when it rains, that is where the water comes from. And that's precisely what we see here now, at least according to P, the priestly author who was in Babylon. So he had every reason to try and make his story much more like the Babylonian creation myth, to make people see that, no, it's like my version of that story, not the Babylonian version of that story. God can do the same things with the waters. So the word that's being used here is the word for like the waters of the sky, as opposed to just the fall of rain. Whereas J doesn't go into that. He just refers to it as rain. So I think that's pretty interesting. Let's see. Okay, so the ark is on Mount Ararat, and then it's been. Oh, I accidentally deleted here something here. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. And then after it's been on Mount Ararat, we've already had 40 days of rain and 150 days of the floodwaters going down, and then another 40 days, and then Noah opens finally opens a window, So what does Noah do? You may remember this. This is kind of a famous thing. Noah sends out a dove. But that isn't the first thing he does, actually, according to the version of the story as we actually have it set out here. So first, he sends out a raven. And the raven flies around the earth and doesn't find anything. It just comes back. Then he sends out a dove. And then the dove comes back. And then he waits another 7 days, and the dove brings back an olive leaf. And then another 7 days. So this is a long process. It's not just 40 days and 40 nights. So you can imagine the sort of scale of this and how, what an impressive sort of story of destruction it's supposed to be if things can take so long. Then finally he sends out the dove, and the dove doesn't come back, which is a sign, that basically it's time for them to get back onto land. Noah goes forth from the ark. And, it depends on how you take this, but you could even interpret it as Noah waits an additional month or so after that. But let's just say it's this many days. And then at that point, God says, "Go forth, Noah," which is kind of interesting. You would think that God could have just, that Noah wouldn't have had to rely on the dove. But there you have it. Noah finally leaves the ark with his family, and all the creatures come with him. So what does Noah do next? Now, this part is very interesting because it sets up a lot of stuff for Hebrew or Abrahamic religion. Noah builds an altar to God, and he makes a sacrifice. Now, this is kind of wild because we're kind of used to the idea that people can make sacrifices to the gods. And the Jewish people originally, like the Greeks, possibly there was some cultural influence there, made animals as sacrifices to God, to their own monotheistic God. But according to the story, this had not taken place up until now. And that's kind of interesting. God had said, in fact, God had only given people plants to eat. Until now. And when Noah builds this altar, God says, every moving thing you shall have it be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, you shall eat everything, except for things with their blood. Do not drink blood. But other than that, um, you can eat everything in the animal world. And so this is the invention of meat eating. And it reminds me a bit of some Greek stories where meat eating is invented. And again, it's specifically linked to sacrifice, to sacrificing the animal to God that you're going to eat. And this makes a lot of sense. Like a religious ceremony that brings people together is a good time to get some meat in your diet, and probably wouldn't happen otherwise. But it's a way for the people who actually own animals, which is not everybody, more upper class than lower class, to sort of show off and to get everybody on their side. So meat sacrifices are a pretty classic tradition. And here, God is basically saying everyone up until this point was vegetarian before, and now you're finally allowed to be meat eaters, which is very interesting. And this is the building of a relationship between Noah and God, which is known as a covenant. Covenant is a connection, an agreement, a contract, you might almost say. That God will take care of the Hebrew people while they take care of God. If they pray to God in the right way and they make sacrifices to God in the right way, then God will make sure that they prosper and have a good life and are happy. And this is, it's interesting because the official moment that the Hebrew people have their full covenant with God comes later on. This is a guy named Abraham. This is the more of the contract style covenant with God. And then later on you have Moses, who has a different covenant and actually has more of the rules worked out with the tablets that are sent to him by God, the 10 Commandments and all that sort of stuff. So these are later figures who are seen as making a contract with God. And in some traditions, like Islam, they are seen as all prophets, the people who speak the voice of God and or convey the messages of God, and also establish the human relationship with God. So this is all very important in the context of this monotheistic religion. It's establishing the very specific kind of relation that the Jews have with God as the chosen people. They don't take on that name until after we get to Abraham. But at this point, Noah is always already kind of foreshadowing that idea that God is going to take care of them and they're going to have these specific relationships to God. Kind of gets built up in stages over the book of Genesis. So that's pretty interesting, that Noah is building this specific contract with God through his sort of religious piety. That's an aspect of why he's a good guy, right? He has a positive, good relationship with God. And it says God takes the smell of the sacrifice and it's pleasing to him. That's very similar to some stuff we see in Greek mythology, where the gods just literally eat the smell and not the meat itself. But here it seems to be more of a loyalty type thing. Let's see. Okay, and yes, and this is another interesting thing is, and you may have heard about this part too, this is one of the more famous parts, God makes a promise. It will not happen again. No more floods. Which is kind of interesting because from a psychological perspective, it's kind of hard to understand how that all goes down exactly. Because, we in our own time see evidence of wickedness and we think, oh, that was reason enough for God to destroy the world. But he won't do it again. But it seems like God maybe he regrets the destruction, or maybe just thinks it's done. He's only going to do this once. And of course, the symbol of the promise and also of the covenant that Noah is making here is the rainbow. The rainbow is, in the sky, and when you see it, it's after the rains have come. So that's God saying, hey, don't worry. This is not one of those apocalyptic, world-destroying rains. This is just, this is just a regular rain. I got you. Let's see. Yeah, and the weird and interesting thing is that here's the quote. God says, I set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. God has a bow? he's, he go around firing his bows and arrows? And in fact, this myth kind of seems to imply that he does. It's this missing older myth, maybe, that God is someone who carries around a bow. Now, you know who does have a bow, and we know this for sure. We have Marduk. Marduk has a bow. And here he is in Babylonian mythology, being all influential on the priestly writer. So that could very much be part of it, that, that influenced this story. And God's promise is the bow. He puts his bow in the sky. It's almost like he's taking his sort of weapons of war away from himself. God promises not to be a war god like other gods in other mythologies. He decides that he's going to be a different type of god, maybe. Maybe this is his last kind of moment of being that war god type of figure, like Marduk. And God is moving away from that. I don't know. There's a lot of interesting things you can pull out of here. And of course, we should mention it's an ideology of the rainbow, right? Why do we have rainbows? Because God is showing us he's taken away his bow and he's taken away his destructive power. And it works because the rainbow is shaped like a bow, in not a pretty ribbon bow, but like the curved bow that you fire arrows from. It has that same curve, so that works pretty well. But yeah, it's interesting. I would love if somebody, discovered the older Hebrew story where God is, wielding a bow. There's a little bit of there's something that appears in the Bible kind of infrequently, but you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit. And it is interesting in the context of what we've been talking about. And this is Leviathan. So Leviathan is just mentioned in a few different places and some more obscure Hebrew texts. And Leviathan is some sort of sea monster. And in the book of Job, when this human known as Job is complaining about all the horrible stuff that God has thrown at him, God basically says, "Don't question me," and says, "Are you me? Have you filled Leviathan's nose with fish hooks?" So it sounds like this is sort of implying a story of God defeating this great sea monster. So even though we left Marduk and Tiamat last week, we're still seeing kind of echoes of it all over the place. And you got to wonder if, this is another priestly thing where God fighting a sea monster is influenced by Marduk fighting Tiamat, or if they both sort of descend from a common ancestor. Okay, but that's a whole bunch of tangents on sea monsters and rainbows. But, that could be one explanation for why God is being seen as a warrior here. So Noah has made the covenant. And now there's this weird little sort of aftermath part here that, what do we think about this? So Noah, he plants seeds in the ground. He tills the soil. He is, in fact, the first tiller of the soil. Which is kind of weird in the light of Adam, but is kind of like the abilities was lost with Cain, who killed his brother. Basically, it's all sort of nuanced and complicated. But Noah grows stuff in the ground, and then what does he grow? He grows grapes, and he gets drunk. So after that, some bad stuff falls out between him and his sons. His son Ham sees him naked, and then Shem and Japheth cover their eyes and turn their faces away. So they don't see him naked, but they just put a blanket over him. And Noah gets mad. Noah curses his grandson, Ham's son, Canaan. And he says, "Cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers." And, Shem and Japheth's descendants are going to be great, but I curse Ham's descendants to be eternally, the slaves and, victims of the other two. So that's really weird, right? So we have this idea of Noah as this righteous man, but here he gets drunk and does something very sort of reckless and strange, and curses this huge portion of his family. Now, why do we have this passage? I mean, on one level, it's an ideology for different people that the Jews didn't get along with. The Canaanites were people who lived in the region of Jerusalem and are more known to historians as the Phoenicians. They weren't necessarily slaves, they were just people that the Jews didn't get along with. So that would be an explanation for why there are the holy people that are the Jews who are descended from Shem and Japheth, and why there are the people that we don't like, that we don't get along with. So that's the curse of Canaan. And it's interesting that we had curse of Cain, curse of Canaan. But this is an ideology for races and strife between them. And then, yeah, and so what do we think of Noah being this good person, but then he goes and does this? Maybe it's saying that the alcohol is enough to demonstrate that he's not, perfect, that he's a flawed person, he has feet of clay. Or alternatively, the alcohol is a dangerous influence, and that's why we should be wary of it, because it makes even good people do bad things. I don't know. You could take it in some different directions. Some traditions seem to say that it's kind of a reward for him, doing the flood stuff. He can just slack off now. It's interesting. Yeah, but I think ultimately originates as an ideology. And I kind of wonder if there's some parataxis going on here. That maybe these are different stories with much different takes on Noah. In one, he's a blameless man. In the other, he's more of just kind of like a folk hero, a sort of wacky character who can do all sorts of things. But in this story, they glue that sort of wacky, silly Noah story onto the story of him doing something great and noble, because it comes from two different perspectives. I don't know. That seems plausible. I don't know if there's any evidence for that, but it's definitely something to think about. Okay, so that's our little exhaustive look at the story of the flood as preserved in the book of Genesis. But there are actually other stories about a great flood. And so I want to look at those in the next video. All right, see you in that one.